Good morning, everyone. Just to make sure everyone signed up for the webinar on Shaping Culture with Process and Data, you have Lead First on the call with David Lynn, who's the Executive Vice President of Strategic Services, as well as myself, Steve Griffin, President of ThinkWise. David is going to be walking us through the 7 critical factors to successfully drive results here in just a moment. I wanted to just remind everyone you are going to be on mute, so please use the chat feature that's going to be to the right of your screen. That allows us to monitor questions throughout, and when we have time towards the end, we'll utilize those questions to help drive some answers to some of you folks you can use back in the workplace or with some of your engagements. So with that, David, I'd like to kick it off to you and let you walk us through some of your areas of expertise with culture change.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Stephen, and welcome, everybody. Our goal here will be to make this as useful and impactful as possible. Just a little bit about Lead First. We've been around, I'll talk about this more in a second. We've been around doing culture work for a long time, and one of the things we've recognized is there are a lot of people, including the people on this phone call, no doubt, who have an abiding interest in and a lot of expertise in this. So our goal is to share what we've learned in terms of what have proven to be the most useful sort of success factors in predicting long-term success. It is our opinion based on experience, and we welcome everybody's opinions and perspectives on this. So we'll talk a bit about culture's relevance in the workplace, something that you probably already feel strongly since you're on this call. Our view of those 7 critical success factors, examples of doing so. We've been working with hundreds of organizations over the last 30 years on this issue, so we have some depth here. And then, of course, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. So a little bit about us, and I don't think you want a big advertisement. You can look at our website and learn more about us if you're interested, but our focus is on culture and the teams and leaders, the development of great teams and leaders to support culture. We've been around since '82. We have 17 people. A lot of our people, unlike some of the sort of softer HR consulting practices, are statisticians and people with measurement capability. So we have a normative database of over 600 cultures, 300 teams, and 34,000 leaders. That data gives us some confidence in some of our conclusions because it is great to be able to bring data to soft things, and that's one of the sort of hallmarks of our firm. And you can see, I won't talk about this in any great depth, you can see some of our clients. They include Fortune 50 behemoths, as well as smaller entrepreneurial startups, and all industries. If you'd, Stephen, talk a little bit about ThinkWise.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, David. So ThinkWise has been around. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. I'd like to say we're a small but mighty team that blends organizational psychology, coding and development with digital marketing. So we're a great amalgamation of different areas of expertise. Our solutions are really core and central around behaviorally based competencies, and we have a competency modeler, which you can check out online. We have hiring that can be highly configured around those competencies. We have online learning called ThinkBox, a team performance survey that goes over 8 critical dimensions of highly effective teams, as well as a hiring solution. Just like the 360, you can complement that by using our competency modeler and leverage the competencies that matter in your organization. We have well over 250,000 users have touched our 360 since our inception, so we've been growing at a nice steady pace, and you'll learn a little bit more later on down in the slides. So David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. And I just want to say the reason that Lead First and ThinkWise are partnering on this is because we've worked closely together. That if, our premise is that if we structure shaping culture in a way that truly drives business strategy, and we can measure that and know that we did it, and use culture, treat it as an important intangible asset, that to make that embedded in reality, the kinds of tools and approaches ThinkWise has proven to accelerate the adoption of culture and driving it into this sort of sinew and muscle mass of an organization. So with that in mind, let's just talk a little bit about some of the principles we've seen. I don't mean to lecture you here, you can read these 6 fairly straightforward principles, and we'll talk about these, but the first is organizational culture is, in fact, an intangible asset of great value. There's so much evidence. We're not going to talk about the research much today, though we love to talk about it. Ours and the research around the world, universities and practitioners and consulting firms of all sorts have been studying the impact of culture on outcomes. And what's clear, the jury's in, is culture does drive outcomes. Certain kinds of cultural characteristics are more associated with those outcomes than others. And if that's true, then we can operate with a little more clarity and proactivity around driving positive, engagement-oriented cultures. It can be defined and it can be measured with precision like any other important asset. That's not easy, and it's not always where we start, but it can be and should be. And it either, number 5, it either drives or impedes strategy execution. That stands to reason. And frankly, success requires informed executive commitment and involvement. We find so often in our work with organizations that honorable people are struggling to get some traction with improving the culture because they really can't get the executive team engaged. And that is often the case, and that doesn't mean all is lost. There are things that can be done, but in the end, it has to be, to really make a difference, has to be driven intentionally by senior leaders. So we start with what behaviors does it take to survive and thrive and fit in around here? That is our cultural definition. And the reason we prefer a behavioral definition is not because it's the only way to look at it. You could talk about it's the shared values. It's all are true. It's anything that guides subtly and even unconsciously the choices people make about how they engage and how they behave. That's all true. But in the end, if we're going to measure it and change it, we have to be able to observe it. And to observe it, we're talking behaviors. So we're not behaviorists, but I think it is a smart way of thinking about it in terms of really making culture change happen. So whether it's behavioral or not, which is not really my point, you can define it any way you want. How are you currently defining culture? This is our first poll question. Do you have a definition in the organization, either what culture is or how you define it for yourselves, etc.? So give us a quick poll. How would you, now you may say, you know, none of these exactly meet your belief or how your organization defines it today. We did our best to capture the range of examples. So we'd ask you to pick one of these 4 that best captures where you are in your own organization.
Thanks, David.
So we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.
Yep, exactly. We're going to give everyone just a few minutes. We'll let some of the stragglers catch up a little bit with responding, and then in just a few moments, we'll close out this poll and we'll show the results of that poll in just a minute. So hold tight, everyone. All right, we just have maybe just a small handful of people that haven't responded yet, so we'll maybe do about 10 or 15 seconds for them, and then we'll show the results. Hold tight.
Great. So these are the results, Stephen?
Yes, they are. So everyone's chimed in and responded. David, and it looks like right in the middle is where you're going to see majority of the responses. So would you like to go over those 2 mainly and maybe just give us some thoughts around why you think those are more prominent?
Yeah, terrific. So we found, and by the way, this is a great place to begin, that an organization from the top down, if there are, as you well know, have a set of principles to which there is agreement, that is a great place to begin. If, as is in the second answer, in B, we think of it as a set of values, but we don't really have common agreement, that also, I mean, that's where you are. So part of the answer is how do we get more clarity about what it is we want? Because in the end, the values and principles represented by those two middle answers are the framework within which we can make productive culture change, right? They aren't enough, frankly, but they are necessary but not sufficient to really shape culture. So it's a great place to begin. And if there is no common definition, you're not really much further behind the other two because, you know, the question is how do we create, and starting at the top, greater clarity about what it is we want. The question we ask really is, what culture, senior executives and everyone else, but we start at the top, what culture, what are the characteristics, what do you think it takes to drive the successful execution of your business strategy long term? What does that take? And that's really how we go about doing this. So let's move on, Stephen.
Sounds great. Thanks, David.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You can take it away. There we go.
Yeah, there it is. Thanks. So that kind of brings us to, in fact, I've already said this, but really the first critical success factor is to define the culture in terms of the organization's strategies and outcomes. I know that's probably logical, but it isn't as easy to do as, I mean, saying that's easier than doing it. So we need to identify what will cause our culture to be successful. What behaviors do we want? It begins with what are the values and principles. Examples might be we want our people to be empowered. We want them to be able to act. We want to keep a focus on customers. We want our people to be proactive. We frankly want people to be excited and engaged. And we can talk, all those are honorable. And by the way, I've never been in an organization. I've personally done this with scores of organizations where there wasn't some, if you ask people in round words, what do you want? There's often common agreement. They understand what engagement means and requires. It's not mysterious. The fundamental characteristics at the highest level aren't really all that mysterious. The question is, what behaviors are we trying to encourage? And really where the rubber meets the road is then, what is the net effect of how we lead and all of our systems and processes and all the vicarious reinforcements in an organization to cause people to choose those behaviors. But it begins with clarity. What's going to make us successful? So with that in mind, there it is. We believe this begins both from the point of view of strategy, meaning what is the business strategy and then what culture, but then if we're going to get it down to behaviors, to embed it, eventually we have to get down to the organizational competency model, meaning what are those behaviors? And ThinkWise, I'll turn it over to you, Stephen. ThinkWise we have found is a remarkably powerful way to help do that. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David, and that's been great so far. So for the audience to understand some of the ThinkWise solutions, we've developed this wheel to help explain how to roll competencies out throughout the organization. And as David's going to continue talking about, it's leveraging the competencies over time to help manage some of that change metrics to let you know how well you're doing around leadership and employee development as you change and shape culture. So it certainly starts well before hiring. That just tends to be one of the more tactical wheels to start leveraging competencies and bringing in the right people and giving them the right job and making sure they're on the right seat in the bus, so to speak. And then aligning them to the goals that they want as well as what the organization needs. And then moving that all the way around when you get to something that's maybe less tactical and something that's very strategic, then you get towards succession planning. And that's when you have to take a look at your competencies again and say, this is what got us here today, but in the next 3 years, are these the same competencies or do we need to make a major shift? That affords you an opportunity to make that major shift in a pretty low-risk situation and saying, we need to change these competencies to another set, and we can start managing change over time with those leaders through coaching, organizational development, team effectiveness training, and letting leaders really demonstrate what those new expectations are. And then over time, you start recycling this wheel. And it's just a great way to help manage some of the smaller pieces to that large-scale culture change, David.
Yes, perfect. And I think you can, thanks, Stephen, and you can see how powerful this is when you marry a tightly defined, easily deployed, clear approach to competency modeling that drives all of those elements that Stephen just described. When that is connected directly to a conscious decision by executives about the culture we're trying to create, the marriage makes it much more powerful than they are independently. So that brings us to how we look at culture. I'm going to just share our model. I hope you'll understand that we acknowledge there are many models out there. We're proud of ours, but I don't mean this to be so much an advertisement for our model per se. The point is to have a model. And our model has, so this really brings us to, how do we define culture? So what we have found, and I'll describe this model briefly, in our research, over time, we keep winnowing down the number of characteristics based on knowledge about which actually drive outcomes most reliably over time and over across industries. So what's dropped out of all of that research are these four opposing values, or there are 8 opposing values, but 4 continua. And so the first is internal focus versus external focus. External focus means focused on the customer, creating value. People know where they are in the value chain. And on the left, you would have more internally focused, where we're focused on our own systems and processes and efficiencies. That's not wrong. The problem is over time, in a highly competed industry, if I'm working for a firm that's much more internally focused, we will be beat by our competitors who are more externally focused. We may need to be internally focused to fix our systems and processes and become more efficient. But in the end, if we get stuck there forever, we can't win in the marketplace. And it's a huge competitive disadvantage. The same with passive versus proactive. I think everyone can see that. We talk about ownership and accountability and initiating and being empowered and taking responsibility and high urgency. That's where proactive lives, versus waiting to be told what to do, often because it's a more fear-based culture. It's more hierarchical, and people are, for whatever reason, unwilling or unable to take more aggressive, proactive action. I imagine you're thinking about your own organizations or your client organizations as you think about this, which would be great. Just kind of think, where are you on this? So collaborative on the right, again, pretty self-explanatory, where people are not only willing but good at engaging one another. It's not the absence of tension. It is dealing with conflict well and being focused on win-win relationships as much as possible. But it's all on winning the game. It's not just about being nice. Versus combative, which of course can be either aggressively combative or passive-aggressive, right? I can be combative by avoiding talking to someone or withholding information, just as I can be by being in competition inappropriately with people. And then agile, the ability to turn on a dime, be creative, come up with divergent solutions, versus stable, which is all about maintaining status quo, not dealing with ambiguity. And again, often that's fear-based, and people don't choose it because they aren't smart and good. They choose it because the vicarious reinforcements of the organization keep them stuck there. And so the point is that on the right, those characteristics, if they're measured accurately, if you have them more than your competitors do, you win in a highly competitive environment. If you have 3x product differentiation, you can win with a lousy culture, at least for a while. We're not arguing it's the only thing that matters. We are arguing that if things are highly competed, if the differentiation between product and quality and service is hard fought and not huge, culture makes a definitive difference. That's not a hope and a dream. That is a fact. So on this model, just so you're clear, what we do is we ask the executives, and working with them after we talk about principles, and they may already have principles, as many of you, as you said in the poll, do have, clearly defined principles. The question is, okay, how do those principles show up behaviorally? What do you want your culture to be? And we don't just ask external, proactive, collaborative, and so on. There are questions that feed each of these, and we say, fill it out based on what you hope people would answer, what you want to be true. Then, that's the blue dot. Then we ask everyone in an organization, and by any demographic cut imaginable or useful, level, department, region, whatever it might be. Other demographics could be gender or generation or all kinds of things. We have them say, well, what is it actually? And typically there are some fairly serious gaps that show up here. That's not unusual. The black dots represent the 50th percentile of 650 organizational units. So that's an overall average. That just gives you kind of, to the right is really good and to the left's not so good. And there are typically gaps. The question is, what do you do to close the gaps? Excuse me, let me go back. This first level that you have a gap between, say, proactive and passive. The next panel, which we're not showing you in any detail here, though, says, well, what would we do about it? And that's where we array and get feedback on all of the potential areas that would drive that gap, right? So it could be communication, respect, and motivation, meaning the behavior of managers. It could be coaching and development. It could be lack of organizational direction. It could be prioritization and work design. We have too many priorities and we're all tripping over each other or can't possibly get all this done. We know how to launch initiatives. We don't know how to stop them, right? It could be total rewards or performance management. The point is there are a finite number of categories of issues that drive the gap between those, and what the system does is allow you to see arrayed before you which of those are most causal to the gap we've identified. What are the lowest bars, and we change those. And then the third level is, of course, the questions that make up that bar or that category. In this case, it's decision-making and influence. And we can score across, in this case, it was an organization with 7,500 people, how do we score on these various issues? So it gives you a dashboard of part of the problem with culture is that it's compelling to people, and we all kind of intuitively get it. The problem is, what do we do about it? We can say, oh, we're not very engaged. Well, what are we going to do about it? And then we go out and we ask people in focus groups, which is, by the way, still a great idea. But if we can get a running start on knowing in advance what's getting in the way, we close the cycle of change. We narrow that gap considerably. So in the end, most of the time when people are excited about culture, it's because they have a new strategy. Something's changing in their environment. That they're entering new markets. They're struggling to break out of their current strategy because the marketplace is causing them to do that. That usually means they're instituting new structures, whether that's wholly a new organization structure or, something's changing beyond simply a strategy. It has ripple effects that are profound throughout the organization. The question becomes, is the culture we have sufficient to support this new strategy? So Peter Drucker is famous for having said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I always love that because we're in the culture business. But I think in some ways our findings is that's not entirely fair. Yes, it's going to be difficult to change one strategy successfully without changing the culture. But if I have a bad strategy and a great culture, that's still a problem. So what we say is they feed on each other, both are required. Which brings us to success factor number 2. And that is, and this may be obvious because we keep talking about engaging the executive team, but we have to make a business case. It's not enough to say, well, we all agree we want high engagement. Yay. Studies have said engagement is good. That's true. By the way, it's profoundly true. And I hope people start there. That's not to be dismissive. But I think to really engage the senior team, even if they say, yes, that's true, when we start asking them to invest or change their own behavior or think about striking more deeply into their own systems and processes to align them to the culture they really want, they start getting cold feet pretty fast unless we bring a really solid business case that has some data around it. The CEO and COO and CFO, as you well know, are used to having people come to their offices and their meetings presenting a compelling business case. Lots of things are good ideas. The question is which ones rise to the occasion and distinguish themselves as worthy of investment. It's not what's a good idea, it's what's the best idea. And if they're going to make culture central to the execution of their strategy, we have to be really good at making a business case. And I don't mean this to be dismissive of our many wonderful clients and people we meet in this business, but that's often where people don't know what to do and where I think we can really help. So again, I'm not going to make that case today, and I will spare you talking through 7 studies. Though there have been hundreds of studies, there are 7 that we turn to the most. They're either ours or others. They're not, it's not just ours, that identify and prove, and we would say proof, and we could show you this proof. We won't do it today. That converge on 2 findings. As I said before, organizational culture drives or is highly correlated with driving business outcomes. If you want greater sales or market share or EBITDA, culture is either helping you or impeding it today. The question is, do you know, and what are you going to do about it? And we also know, and again, this is using our language, but lots of models have similar language, perhaps, that organizations with dynamic cultures markedly outperform those who don't. So we not only know that culture matters, we know which characteristics matter the most. And that's what these studies, and I'm not going to go through them, but they're in banking, they're in retail. The Firms of Endearment Study 5 is a book of which we were a part and contributed that identifies firms that have been most obviously winning on the basis of culture and studying what it is they do and proving many of the assertions we're making here today. It's published by Wharton if you're interested, Firms of Endearment. There's actually the newest version of it. The follow-up was just published a year ago. So with this in mind, we need to be able to prove, and I'm not going to review these, that culture can drive things that matter. Now, often people say, oh, it's all about the bottom line. That's kind of true, of course, but it's really about the execution of strategy, which is about the bottom line. So we can prove and have shown that if we do this right, we can improve. I'm looking at the top one. Clearly, you can cut down on attrition and all we all recognize that one. That's easy, meaning easy to understand. It's not easy to do. But we can improve employee, sales per employee or EBITDA per employee, or all kinds of measures that we said we'd do it, we went out and did this work, and it happened. That's what's compelling to the C-suite, as I know you understand. This brings us to success factor number 3. I've made the point already, but we really have to engage the executive team. We work with so many great clients and consultants and others who have been joined with us in this, who are in a situation where they don't have the attention of the senior team, or maybe they're tacitly involved, they're kind of interested, but are they really putting it on their list of key priorities? No, but they still recognize, and they don't want to give up on, the need to shape culture, to make it a more productive, positive, engaging environment for people. And so while we always appreciate and admire those activities, and we're not suggesting people give up, the fact is there's no real traction until the senior team gets involved. Sometimes you have to work hard to get them involved, so we're not saying get their engagement or go home. That's not fair. You live there and work there every day. That's not helpful. But in the end, if we're serious about it, let's go get them involved. And that's why these critical success factors relate to one another, because one of the ways you do that is by having a measurement system, and you can prove results and you can make a great business case. So we see it as having really 2 pathways to transform culture. I've mentioned one more than the other. The one I've mentioned more is removing structural barriers. In the measurement system I was describing before, we said, well, the challenge, if you really want to move from static to dynamic, it may be how you make decisions. Too many decisions are made higher up in the organization than they need to be. We're not really empowering people. Decisions take far too long. We're moribund by a bunch of red tape. Those are structural barriers. They're also, however, leadership challenges. And so one of the ways that our partnership with ThinkWise has paid off so brilliantly for us is that when we're in the transform leadership part of this, we need leaders at all levels to be clear on what constitutes leadership that will drive the culture you seek. We challenge them to begin leading now as though they already have that culture. The question is, well, what is that? And so getting them to align around that and then be able to drive it through the kinds of tools and processes that ThinkWise offers is the most powerful combination to do that. This brings us to success factor 4. I've applied it already, but we believe the best way to galvanize senior leaders is to bring data. In fact, they will insist on data. Now, the exact sequence of events of when you bring data is specific to that local situation. In some cases, we bring data, meaning we do a proxy culture measure before we even meet with them, because they'll offer opinions. Well, our culture really is X, it's Y. No, I think it's Y, not X. No, I think it's Z. Well, those are all opinions. What if we bring facts? Well, here's what your people said it is. That gets their attention. And so that's why we feel so strongly that data needs, and there are a lot of ways to do it, and you can dribble it in, doesn't have to be done all at once. But if we're going to make a business case, by definition, you have to be bringing some kind of data. You can't just have opinions, and you can't just let their collective opinions dilute the effort, because they'll think they're in alignment, but they don't really do anything, and they move on to the next thing. It's soft. If we're going to make the soft things have a harder edge, we've got to bring data. So I've already shown this. That's how we go about doing this, is we go get data from them. Often the first time we've met with senior executives, they've already completed our survey based on what they want the answers to be. What culture do you want? And we can show them. They agree. Even the most hard-bitten, old-school, Theory X, authoritarian leader generally describes a good culture as having people who take initiative, aren't afraid, own things, are accountable, are focused on customers. I mean, it seems obvious. Now, the fact of the matter is they may be part of the problem. Their behavior may be preventing it, but it doesn't mean that they don't see that that's what's really required to execute their strategy. There are few outliers. Now, they may think differently question to question, but overall, they want a dynamic culture. And so we're able to take that, and then we can show them or get their permission to go get data and say, instead of speculating about the culture you have today, let's go find out. And we can do it very efficiently and very quickly. So I mentioned earlier, we have the broad dashboard of the cultural characteristics, proactive, collaborative, et cetera. But what lay in the gap? And I've mentioned these already. I'm just showing them to you, some of them in a little more detail. So in this case, the red bars or the lowest bars are those things that most drive the gap between where you need to be and where you are. So the culture of the future requires a certain kind of decision-making, much more proactive, probably making decisions at a lower level. Everyone wants to agree to that, but why do we keep holding decisions too high? Why is it so hard for people to make decisions in large corporations? Why is it that there's too much micromanagement and control of decision-making? And so one of the things we can help them see is, if you want to be a dynamic culture for you at an enterprise level, you ought to be focused on the red bars. And in specific, in this case, let me go back one, that would mean in decision-making and influence, for example, we would now at least know the answer lay in making decisions more quickly, making them at a lower level. What lay in the gap of that? Well, that's where we turn to ThinkWise. We have to start looking at, do they have the capability to make decisions? And we have to be analyzing what competencies are required to make that happen. So let me turn this over to you, Stephen, to talk about that a bit.
Thanks, David. And I want to bring to everyone's attention back when you're talking about your fourth critical success factor around bringing data together. Without data, you really don't have a business case. That's going to be an important message with this slide, because this is how you're looking at bringing some of that data together. Well, and I'll talk about just the 360 for the sake of the slide and time. Most folks do the unfortunate thing of looking at a 360 as giving the leader feedback. See, the value of the 360 tool, especially the one for ThinkWise, is looking at leaders across the organization, across departments, and cascading them from supervisor all the way to C-suite. So our 360 solutions able to aggregate leadership data on their competency development over time. So you're able to see all of the changes that are happening kind of at the micro level of leaders making shifts from what was a year one plan, so to speak, to a year three plan, and watching those leaders grow and develop and seeing where their strengths are being leveraged, where the challenges continue to be prevalent, and allow organizations and OD experts to come in and start grabbing maybe different leaders in the organization that have a strength that can compensate an executive, so to speak, that's having a lot of trouble, say, with decision-making quality. And you may have an emerging leader that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to connect those dots, because, like I said, the unfortunate thing is people tend to look at them at really just the individual level and seeing how that leader is doing and providing just that leader feedback. The value of 360 is really looking at the entire enterprise. So with that, David, I'll hand it back over to you. It's just the key thing here was bringing data together to tell a story.
Yeah, great, Stephen. Thank you so much. And just I have one other point on that. I think, as you can see, if the connectivity here, and I want to underscore how powerful we've seen it be with clients, is if we say, well, let's do a 360, that's a good thing to do, and everything Stephen just said. But if we say we've come together, we're clear what defines our culture and therefore the leadership philosophically, practically, and behaviorally. We know a lot more now what we consider to be great leadership, and we're really not going to accept a lot else. This isn't just a matter of opinion. Oh, Bob or Mary or John, they're very authoritarian. They're difficult to get along with. They like to get their own way, and people are afraid of them. That's just the way they are. Well, that damages the culture, and it's not acceptable. And if we're really going to get aligned about this, and I'm not suggesting we go out and yank them out of their jobs, and we don't have that authority, and it's not my point. But if we really want to galvanize an organization, we're able to cascade this greater clarity throughout the entire organization, because the 360 definitions that ThinkWise makes so easy to do, to define your 360s in a way that really conform to and reflect that culture of leadership. So with that in mind, here's a couple other critical success factors, and that is there's an incrementalism that people get into with culture because it's so big. And so there are a lot of people running around doing a lot of small things that aren't necessarily coordinated. And I don't mean to castigate them for their efforts, because you got to do something. And often people, the cards they're dealt in terms of executive commitment and budget and authority aren't the same everywhere. And so whatever you do, if it's clearly designed to drive the culture that you want, do something. But if we're serious, we've got to think big and we have to act fast. We have to shock the system. If we're going to change it, it's not let's get a little bit better every year and maybe someday we'll have a dynamic culture. That's a great way to spend a lot of time and money and stay more or less where you are. So that's what these all feed each other. That's why we feel like we have to make a great business case. We've got to bring data, and we have to engage the senior team. We have to have a plan. We have to get their commitment, but now we have to go do things that matter. And again, that's some of the embedding tools are where we found ThinkWise to be so helpful. There are only two more here. So in addition to that, though, we want to start at the top and we want to think big, and we need to be empowered to think big and act fast, which means by definition, we are empowered by the C-suite. But we also have to involve everyone. And I'm probably preaching to the choir when I say this, and I don't think anyone would make the opposite. But people throughout the organization have profoundly thoughtful opinions about and observations about how we can make this culture better. And so when we start, we have data that tells us where to look, in which things to focus on first. In our example, it was decision-making and influence is number one, or it might be, this comes up so often now, prioritization, that people say, it's questions like, we have too many competing priorities, or I'm constantly pulled in different and conflicting directions, so people aren't getting enough done. The system is overburdened, and they're literally getting less done than they would if they had fewer priorities to pursue. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. But when we get to, okay, what do we do about this? That becomes a lot more bottom up. We need to involve everybody, and we need a structured approach to do that efficiently. And then finally, we've got to integrate everything. And by that, I mean, we could have 12 disparate sort of activities going on to help change the culture. But what we want and need is something that will pull together all of these disparate factors and help drive productive action top down, bottom up, and keep things sort of coordinated. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen to talk just a little bit about sort of how the ThinkWise approach, it's not the only way to do it any more than lead first culture model is the only way to measure and drive culture. There are a lot of smart, great people out there, but we have found it, of all the ones we've seen, to be by far the most compelling. So let me turn it over to you, Stephen.
David, thank you. So everyone by now probably can recall this, maybe a dozen or so slides back. This is really just the wheel of how to leverage competencies through a lot of learning engagements, organizational development engagements, talent acquisition engagements, and then even within OD, you certainly have team development and succession planning. But the idea is, with having a strategy and vision, you can walk in almost any large, mid-sized, and small organization. You're going to see a plaque on the wall. And that plaque's going to have some sort of story, and they're going to have language that shapes around having values and principles, and it may even use the words like strategy and vision. Now, the telling thing of whether or not that is true, what's written on the wall, is to ask your everyday employee that's there, the true cog of the organization, how does that get lived in the organization? And when they can't define those behaviors very concretely, it's just words on a wall, right? They have to make sure that they're able to define what those behaviors are every day. And it doesn't matter if they're a surgeon or a janitor or a nuclear engineer. The strategy and vision that's on the wall need to come to life for everyone in meaningful everyday words. And David, you used the term that I'll use, and that's just behaviors. While we're not true behaviorists per se, if you don't use behavior, you can't measure it, right? It's not the intangible or the X factor. You really do need to see observable behaviors. What does risk-taking look like in an organization? What does decision quality look like in an organization? How do people observe, judge, and rate oral communication, and how is that valued? So the competencies need to be behaviorally described in such a way that every single employee, no matter where they are in the hierarchy, can define them and live them every day, David.
Yes, great. Well said, Stephen. Thank you. So we've already talked, I showed you this slide also a little earlier, but I think in the end, our challenge is HR professionals, and I don't know that everyone on this call is an HR professional, but let me just speak to those who are either HR professionals or care deeply about the human factor and think that way. Our challenge is to make the soft stuff, which we know intuitively, most leaders know intuitively, that the people, the soft stuff, is really the hard stuff and matters so much. But I think we have an opportunity to be much more successful in making this case and in making the people element of business front and center and part of the strategy beyond. I mean, people are almost always the largest or second largest cost factor of any business. And yet the rigor with which senior leaders look at people, they just make a bunch of assumptions. There's not enough clarity about how do we measure these outcomes. So, we know that doing this well, and we've seen this, and we're very proud of this, that as we said earlier, we can, of course, decrease attrition. I think really the issue there, as you well know, it's not just the number, it's who's leading. If we can decrease attrition, voluntary turnover among people we want to keep, that's what really matters. But beyond that, we can, using this approach, have a material impact on sales per employee, on EBITDA, on market value, or whatever proxy. If you're a privately held firm, that may not be market value, but we can. And then sort of an interim measure is we can show that the culture improved by doing follow-up measures. We can measure the cultures we've described. We can engage in the 7 factors and do what we need to do to drive change, and then we can show it change. In some cases, that's actually enough for an executive. We're busy trying to prove the business case. They say, well, look, we know culture is causal. We've improved the culture. We were with a firm last week where they improved on that 100-point scale of the 4 factors that we have, the 8 competing values. In an 11-month period, they increased 9 points, which is a lot for a company that has thousands of employees. And it proved to them they can really make a difference. And they're seeing all kinds of benefits. So we keep going back to, well, we have to connect this to EBITDA. We have to connect it. And they go, yeah, but we get it. So once they get it, and they're not asking us to prove it, that's fine. But we have to go in assuming that we have to prove it. And the good news is we can. So this brings us to the second poll question. And you can read this. But if you had to change your culture to be more successful as an organization, how would you start? Well, literally, if you think about wherever you are, maybe you've begun and you're far along here and you can think back on your journey. But let's imagine at the beginning, how would you begin? What would you want to do first? By the way, this isn't a trick question because you can make a case for any of these. I'm just curious to see, we thought it'd be interesting to see where you'd want to begin in your situation.
Thanks, David. We'll give everyone a few minutes to weigh in on our second poll question, and then we'll bring together the results and take a look at how it's going to shape out. So we'll just give everyone just a couple of minutes. All right, everyone, we're going to bring over the responses we've gotten, and they'll be on your screen here momentarily. And David, almost like the other one, it's the middle is where a majority of people are responding. So why don't you take a look at what the responses are.
Perfect sense and is not surprising. Let me just say, I think, as is suggested here, so the answer would be conditional on your where you are in your organization. So you could make the case that the first thing you do is go meet with the senior leadership because you may already have done some of these other things, right? But I think the implication here is we advocate strongly we need to engage senior leadership. And the problem is that sometimes some of them are committed to not doing this. They don't care. That's a hard road. Others, it's a much more open field. Others are driving us to make change because they get it. So it might be meeting with certain key leaders and building some support. And so the question then becomes whether it's with the whole senior team or whether I'm just going to go meet with our more progressive, I'm making this up, COO or CIO or whoever it might be to get her or his support, right, to form a partnership where we're working on this together. The question is, what is necessary for us or me, for you, to be successful in really enjoining them in this pursuit? What do I need to do? And that might mean I need to begin building the business case. And building that business case mean I might want to bring some data on the organization so that they know that I know what I'm talking about. In other words, what evidence is required to win the debate? That's the question. And it depends on not debate's the wrong word, to win the point. If I'm meeting with a C-level person who already mostly agrees with me, I still want to bring some data for credibility and bring value to this. If I'm enjoying the senior team and there are skeptics in the room, the standard for evidence is much higher. So that's the way we think about it. All these are perfectly good places to begin. And by the way, if I have a senior team, and I know this was only one person, but if I have a senior team who I think is open to the idea of greater clarity of principles and values, that's not a wrong place to begin by any means. It's not the usual place, but it's not a wrong place. You could start anywhere. The pathway is what is going to engage the senior team to take the hill, if you will, with credibility so that they are open to seeing this as the powerful, intangible asset that it really is. So if we could move on from there and remove that data, or can we just move on?
Yep, keep going, David. So David, we actually have a really great question that just came through right now that I want to post and have you respond to the audience if you're up for it.
Sure, love to.
All right, so so far everyone seems to be enjoying the content, David. So from the audience, they want to say thank you. But the question specifically is, can you speak to any experiences that you've come across when working with organizations that you've been able to track very specific tactics or interventions to help the organization kind of midway through to figure out what they can continue doing, stop doing, versus needing to initiate something new?
It's a great question. Thank you for that. And in our system, and again, I have to speak of it from how we go about doing it, but from our point of view is, so to your point, we generally at some point are meeting with the senior team, getting them engaged, setting up a culture action team driven by HR, but also senior line people, whoever the right people are. And we look at the data even more deeply, and we devise both by engaging others in the organization. We have tons of data from everyone. So we might go ask the people in IT more why they answered about decision making this way. So we're doing some data gathering. But we come together and we propose and launch some initiatives that we think are going to drive deep into the system. It's not enough just to say, let's talk up our principles and let's make sure everybody gets it and maybe it'll all dribble out. We have to go change something. And usually when we change things, it's a little upsetting to somebody. If we're making leaders conform more clearly to a clearly defined model of great leadership, we're going to make them a little uncomfortable sometimes. Good. There's nothing wrong with that. If we're going to change the performance management system and make different requirements or change how we make decisions, et cetera, you get the idea. There'll be some discomfort. So we launch those initiatives, and at some point, to your great question, we come together and we gather data. Both we can do pulse surveys that only pertain to the questions that relate most closely to that initiative. And we can see midstream, are we making a difference? So that we can either heat up certain initiatives that are really working or cool down or even stop initiatives that are either done or really just didn't quite hit the mark. So there is this need to refine along the pathway. You're adding initiatives, you're retiring initiatives, and we advocate that you only take on a finite number, a handful of serious initiatives, because these are not sidebar little things we're doing. These aren't making banners and let's have a few more meet and greets with our folks to talk to them some more. Nothing wrong with that. But if that's the nature of the initiatives, we're missing the mark. So we do have that experience. In fact, everywhere we work, we have the experience of having to shape these initiatives and change them over time based on data, the baseline, and then data we gather along the way.
David, that's great. And with our last question, it's probably related to the last statement about gathering data along the way that was made. We have a question where it's being posed of whether or not the timing of maybe the second, third, or fourth time of doing the culture change measurement. The question has to do with when is it too soon, and how do you know that it's the right time to measure that culture change for the second time around?
Oh, for the second time around, that's great. Yeah, I'd say so. We got baseline data, right? And we have this data by every useful demographic cut. We can decide there's an infinite number we can gather as long as that group, that cohort has at least 5 people in it. We can measure it, and we can show it in a dashboard, and we can see how they differ. And it's such rich data, right? So it takes a while, as you know, to have a real impact on culture. We do things and it lags a while. You know, we had a situation recently where one of the biggest issues was in the category of organizational clarity, organizational direction. People said one of the things that's impeding our culture being more dynamic is that we're not sharing information about the strategy. We're not galvanized by clarity of what our principles are, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, and they did a great job, the senior team, of not only coming up with clearer statements and communicating more proactively and cascading it down and building that into leadership expectations. We even created a thing we call a success narrative, which is it's not enough just to have a strategy statement or vision and mission. It's the dialogue. Those are ingredients. They're not a cake. You can't just say, well, look at our vision statement. Well, they say, yes, as you said, Stephen, there's words on a wall. I don't get it. What's the point? So we taught them how to have the dialogue, and we thought we did a bang-up job. And we did a pulse survey, and in 6 months, it had a little blip of an impact. It wasn't nearly what we hoped for. But without doing anything differently, we just stayed the course. In a year, well, it's actually, this is the one that was 11 months, it had a huge impact. So it depends on the initiatives, but I think the first full remeasure is probably a year after the first measure. You can make an argument for sooner. And again, we can do unlimited pulse surveys. So you might do little pulse surveys of this group on these questions. You don't have to do the whole thing all along the way. But to go back and say, have we really made a difference? The pace of change in culture tends to be slower than the pace of change in, you know, improving customer service metrics or whatever. And so if it's a smaller organization and we're doing, you know, and the path is very clear, you could make a case for 6 months. When we did this for Division of Texaco, we waited 18 months because it was tens of thousands of people. But that's sort of the range of what we find. Enough time to make a difference, but not so much time that we get complacent.
Thank you, everyone, for joining with us today. David, thank you and your team at Lead First for putting together today's topic on culture change. I want to remind everybody that you will receive an email later on with the PowerPoints. So everyone who asked for PowerPoints, you'll get that in an email directly after this. So that'll be sent to you here shortly. David, thank you again for taking the time out today and helping everyone understand the dialogue process and Lead First expertise around that, as well as leveraging ThinkWise's solution during that engagement to help manage the data and help make that business case, David. So thank you.
It's truly my pleasure. And if I just remind everyone, look, if this is of interest and you'd like to talk to Stephen or to me or to anybody in our respective organizations, we'd be delighted, and we really appreciate your being a part of this today.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to end that for today and let everyone get back to their busy week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.